Hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to a new edition of the Indian Express Explained Live, earlier known as E Explained, our series of online explanatory conversations with domain experts and authorities on specific subjects. I am Monijit Majumdar, editor for explanatory journalism at the Indian Express. We think of explained as being rooted in the news, but which goes beyond just the news. It is context, it is background, it is connecting the dots, it is explanation. It is what gives you a richer, fuller, more complete understanding of what's going on in the world around us. We do online events like this about once a fortnight. We've already had several sessions on the economy, and this evening we are back to talking about it again. So, 6.5 months after the lockdown was first announced in the third week of March, where do we stand? Traffic is back on the roads. As you can see, migrant workers have returned to their workplaces in most cases. Most industries have started producing again, but many challenges persist. Halfway into this financial year, what is the progress so far, and what are the expectations for the full year? What can be done to expedite growth? To talk about all of these and related issues, we have with us Dr. Sajjid Chinoy, among the sharpest and best informed analysts of the Indian economy today. Sajjid is JP Morgan's chief India economist and part-time member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. He is also a member of the Advisory Council to the 15th Finance Commission and has previously served on several committees and task forces of the Reserve Bank of India. Sajjid, welcome to the Indian Express Explained.
Good evening. Great to be here.
You have been an expert at this event earlier. You also write frequently for the Indian Express. We are honored to have you back with us. Thank you for your time.
Pleasure.
Speaking to Sajjid will be the executive editor of our paper, P. Vaidyanathan Iyer. After about 45 minutes of the conversation between Sajjid and Vaidi, we will open the door for a limited number of questions from you. Thank you, all of us, for joining again, and welcome. Vaidi.
Thank you, Manojit. Thank you, Sajjid, for joining us. It is always such a pleasure to talk to you online and offline. Sajjid, we have, it's been 6 months into the pandemic and more than 6 months. And of course, India had a very strict lockdown. But if you just look at the rest of the world, the whole world, so to say, 1 million lives lost due to the coronavirus pandemic, COVID-19, and world output has also kind of the expectations or estimates of world output in 2020 have varied significantly. We have the latest, IMF projections for the world economy, which seem to say that, which kind of say that the world economy would decelerate or contract by about 4.2% in 2020. In June, just 4 months back, they had said that the world economy would contract by minus 5.2%. So that was there's an upward revision in how the expectations on the economy front as far as the whole world is concerned. But India has very surprisingly, or I'm not sure whether surprisingly, but India's growth is expected to kind of drop 10.3%. That's a sharp contraction, in double-digit contraction, which was being talked about by most analysts as we in the first quarter. So, can you just, to start off with, how do you assess the world economy today?
Thank you, very good evening, everyone. It's great to be here. Whether we use the word, or we used to use the word before 2020, unprecedented, very loosely and very casually. I think having lived through 10 months of 2020, we really now know what unprecedented is. And I think we're seeing this on the economic front. Just look at the data globally for the first few quarters. The first quarter globally contracted 11% quarter on quarter annualized. The second quarter contracted 20% quarter on quarter annualized. Just for listeners, this is the largest global contraction ever recorded, truly historical. The third quarter, on the back of these two quarters, is accelerating sharply, 35%. Again, a record of a very depressed base. Now, a couple of points I want to make. We're going to hear there's a lot of discussion globally about the alphabet soup. Is it a V-shaped recovery? Is it W? Is it K? Is it Z? we should distinguish growth rates from levels. Let me give you a case in point. Suppose I'm an economy manufacturing 100 widgets and I contract by quarter. That means I'm producing 50 widgets. Now, if I grow by 50% the second quarter, if I simply look at growth rates, let's say, I'm back to where I was. But remember, the 50% growth is of half the base. And so in level terms, you are only at 75 widgets. You're still 25% below where you were. So whenever we are talking about outcomes in this environment, always look at levels, not growth rates. Now, that said, there is a little bit of good news. The IMF, as you said, has increased its global forecast, growth forecast between June and October. Minus 5.2 has become minus 4.4. But almost all of this upgradation is with developed markets because they've had much more policy support and their second quarter growth was much stronger than the IMF thought. Emerging markets or developing economies have been downgraded further by another 20 basis points. But I think the most important part in all of this, because there'll be an obsession about these growth rates for this year and next year, and the numbers will change every few months given the quantum of uncertainty. The question we should be asking ourselves 9 months into the pandemic is, what is the permanent damage that COVID is going to do to economies around the world? And I think that's the key question. 2 years from now, will there be permanent damage to output? And this is where the IMF's analysis is important. It actually estimates that there will be $11 trillion of lost output in 2020, 2021, which is not surprising. But over the next 5 years, there'll be $28 trillion of lost output. The short point is that the permanent damage to the global economy is going to be far greater than just these 2 years. It's going to last for the next 5 years. In particular, the fund estimates that for developed markets, there will be 3.5% of GDP below what they would have been pre-pandemic. And emerging markets will be 5.5% of GDP compared to what they would have been pre-pandemic. So that's the key point here, that whatever growth forecast we had in December of 2019, for the next 4 or 5 years, economies will be producing between 3 and 5% less than that. They use the word scarring. Well, it's a euphemism for permanent loss. And I think that's the worrying part here. And what is a 9-month pandemic is going to have an impact for multiple years.
So essentially what you are saying, Sajjid, is that, for us to get back to even 2019 levels, it would take us a much longer time of, 2 to 3 years. It is not going to kind of get back to even the 2019 levels in the next year or probably the year later.
Except for one country in the world, we all know that China. China is the only country that's bucked the odds. If you take China out of the equation, all developed markets and all emerging markets, even in 2021, will not be at their 2019 level output. But I'll just say one thing, Vedi, the right measure, even when we talk about India, is when we talk about permanently lost output, you have to say, what will GDP be 2 years from now? And compare it to what we thought GDP would have been pre-COVID. Yeah. And that's the real loss that we should be focusing on. That's the real loss. That's the thought experiment.
Absolutely. One thing which also, which is very interesting, and when I kind of always look at the rest of the world and India, is like, the fiscal support to which, globally governments have given. IMF says it is about $12 trillion in the post immediately after the COVID, the kind of fiscal support, besides, of course, a lot of monetary measures, which, all central banks have kind of done. So is there a kind of divide between the developed world, which can afford such large fiscal support, and the developing world and emerging markets, developing world being including India, where, fiscal support has not been quite dramatic? Is the dichotomy in kind of recovery partly because of the fiscal support?
Absolutely, Vedi. It's fiscal and monetary. And, this is in a way, developed markets, because of their institutional history, because of the credibility they've earned, have the luxury of waking up one morning and writing a check for 5% of GDP. And bond markets actually cheer that. Don't get spooked by that. Look at what the Fed has done. The Fed has essentially gone from quantitative easing to regulatory easing to credit easing, right? So these countries have the institutions that have a lot of latitude. And it's precisely the quantum of that support. We've seen this in the US, we've seen this in Europe, massive wage subsidy programs. We've seen this in Japan that has buffered the shock. Now, emerging markets, unfortunately, just don't have the luxury of that unfettered approach. Right? I mean, the US has exorbitant privilege. The dollar is the reserve currency of the world. Emerging markets will have to worry about what investors think. Will there be capital outflows? What will ratings agencies think? How will markets react? What will happen to, for 20 years, emerging markets have focused on inflation targeting. Now, central banks can't jump in and, monetize deficits without worrying about the reputational risk. So we start on the back foot, all emerging markets. It's a very good question you ask. And this explains the IMF's divergence, that in the next 5 years, the loss to emerging markets is greater than developed markets, in part because the fiscal support can't be as big, and in part because, the health systems, social distancing, safety nets are just, not as robust and not as institutionalized as they are in developed markets.
Right. So, say, Sajjid, let's come to India now. Specifically, if we look at, say, since the pandemic, we have got, at least a couple of big packages which the government announced, basically looking at the very poor and the vulnerable through the Pradhan Mantri, Garib Kalyan Yojana. And then subsequently that there was a Atmanirbhar Bharat package, which was announced in June, if I'm not wrong, mid-May, if I'm not wrong. And then we had very recently, a couple of days back, the finance minister did talk about, some capital expenditure by center and states, as well as some measures to boost spending. So given the measures that India has taken over the last 6 months, April to say, mid-October, what has that done to the economy?
Well, there's been a lot of measures first on the monetary side, right? The central bank has moved early and aggressively, like other central banks, almost 175 basis points of rate cuts. We've seen, 6 trillion now of interbank liquidity. We've seen the RBI constantly roll out new instruments. There was regulatory easing through higher HTM ratios. We saw forward guidance being introduced for the first time in India. So the central bank has done whatever it can. I'm sure at some point we'll talk about some of those trade-offs that the RBI may face if inflation is sticky. I think on the fiscal side, I think the government's made a conscious approach to go about this in a stepwise manner, right? To do this in bits and pieces. And I think at some level, that approach can be explained by the fact that, stimulus is more effective when the economy is open. Remember, if you've got lockdowns and supply bottlenecks, then you can't have a supply response. If people can't leave their house, how will they spend? So, one rationale could be that, as the economy opens up, fiscal multipliers get higher and we can spend. Then also there's more information about what the damage is and therefore what the fiscal support is. But Reddy, if you just step back, and I know there's a vibrant fiscal debate in India, the fact is, we entered this crisis with a consolidated deficit of between 9 to 10% of GDP, which is large. Debt to GDP was about 72, and even without much stimulus, it will be 85 or 90 post-pandemic. So a lot of fiscal space had been used up in 3 years before the crisis. We kind of tend to forget the economy was slowing and government spending was very strong, right? That government spending in the last 3 years was 11% a year, which was twice the rate of the private sector. So a lot of fiscal space did get used up in the 3 years, unfortunately, before the pandemic. Now, I think the question before the government now is that there will be permanent damage to India as well as there will be to other countries. And the question is, how much firepower do you save for later and how much firepower do you use for now? My own personal view is to use it sooner rather than later, because think of what the objective is in this crisis here. You want to prevent economic non-linearities. You want to prevent firms from going bankrupt. The minute a firm goes bankrupt, you lose entrepreneurial capital. There are job losses. There's hysteresis in the labor market. You want to provide income support to households so they can get through, and you want to backstop the financial system. So the trade-off here is, on the one hand, the later you wait, maybe you get a higher fiscal multiplier, but you want to act soon enough to prevent these non-linearities, because once these non-linearities occur, that hurts the productive capacity of the economy going forward.
Yeah. Yeah, but say last at least 2 weeks we have been seeing a lot of numbers on recovery. Be it the PMI indices, being looking at port traffic or rail freight. Uh, all these high frequency indicators kind of suggest that that the recovery is on course, and it seems that India will be out of the woods. But when you just step back and look at the overall numbers, the numbers still kind of do not match up to the flurry of positive
Yeah,
news that we see. So can you explain that aspect
sure.
to us?
It's a very good question because people will be asking, how do you reconcile an IMF's contraction of 10% with the strong high frequency number in September? Well, a couple of things. So, firstly, there is some good news. Remember, much of that 24% contraction in the April to June was because the economy was shut down. So, as the economy opens up, we would expect a rebound. And the good news is the following, that we're seeing a pretty strong rebound, particularly in goods and industry. Number one. Number two, that frankly the mortality rates, the true infection rate in India continues to get lower. So some of that risk, the fear premium has gone away, and you're seeing households gradually begin to normalize their activities, and that's showing up in mobility. And the third piece of good news is if you look at the household consumer confidence surveys, for the first time in September, households are a little bit more optimistic about the future 1 year out versus what they were in July. So at least three different pieces of good news. Now, I would caution that we need to interpret this data very carefully, at least for three reasons. One is some of this could just be pent-up demand. As I mentioned, the global economy, the third quarter is growing at 35% annualized, but the fourth quarter will be 7%. So we may well be seeing that households will spend in September and October what they would have otherwise spent in April to August. So let us see if this sustains. The more important point is, remember, services are 55% of GDP. And what we're measuring mainly, exports, imports, IP, freight, cargo, these are all goods. And around the world, you're seeing that there's a two-speed recovery. The goods sector is recovering much faster than the services sector. So what we are actually measuring is largely the goods sector, and we're saying goods are back at about 90% of pre-pandemic levels. And some people will then impute, oh, that means GDP is back at 90% of pre-pandemic levels. That's not the case. Services are, as I mentioned, 55% of GDP. If you look at core GDP, you look at trade services, hotel services, professional services, construction services, these are recovering much more slowly. So we should not look at the goods sector and impute what's happening to global GDP, because that's the services. But the last point I'll make, Vedi, and perhaps this is the most important, is the recurring theme from the beginning, which is ultimately we have to ask ourselves 2 years from now, where will India's GDP be compared to what all of us had forecasted before the pandemic? What will that lost output be? And that will depend crucially on the hysteresis in the labor market and financial markets. And on the labor market, we still need to be a little bit worried and vigilant. If you look at the PMIs that you quoted, output has gone up, orders have gone up, but employment levels are still much below COVID. And if you look at the CMI data, that's a little bit more sobering. 6 million jobs have been lost since COVID. But the real issue there is the composition. The CMI estimates that about 17 million salary jobs have been lost. That's 20% of all salary jobs. And that is being offset by rural jobs increasing by about 7 million. So if 17 million salary jobs have been lost, that is going to have an impact on future consumption, on household behavior. And in fact, in the same RBI surveys I spoke about, households are feeling better about the future in terms of growth and employment. But if you ask households, where will your spending be 1 year from now? It is consistently and significantly lower than what they had said before the pandemic. So we still have to be very vigilant. We're not out of the woods yet.
Yeah. So, as you pointed out, Sajjid, on the services sector, which is the frontline sectors have been the worst hit, be it hotels, tourism, aviation, even restaurants, all of this, which we are, with, say, increasing urbanization over the last 2 decades. I think, these have become big kind of employment generators as well. And But that seems to be, if that continues to languish and the fear of COVID kind of stays, because at the end of the day, people are saying that the only way you can the fear will vanish is a probably a vaccine. So are we kind of saying that till July of next year, till kind of vaccine trials are on phase 2 and phase 3, till a vaccine comes, it is going to remain like this in the services industry?
I think we'll have to open in a calibrated and intelligent manner. We're seeing in Europe what's happening in Europe. Europe opened too soon. People got too relaxed. Now they've seen a huge surge in infection rates. We're seeing this in Great Britain. We're seeing this in Spain. We're seeing this in France. And now mobility has been hurt again. So I think this is not all or nothing. I think we'll have to open slowly. We'll have to learn to live with the virus. But in the high contact services sector, I think the opening is going to it will be far more calibrated, right? And therefore, that's precisely why I'm saying let's not look at industry and say industry is back at 95% of pre-pandemic levels, and that's where GDP is, because the high contact services sectors, hotels, restaurants, transportation, things will improve. I think we will learn to live with social distancing. We learn to live with masking. But as you said, it's only when there's a vaccine and the fear completely dissipates that human behavior will go right back to normal.
Yeah. So going ahead, where do we see growth coming from, Sajjid? If we are saying that, say services will still kind of remain a little subdued even with calibrated opening, where does growth come from? Where do jobs come from?
Yeah, it's a very good question, Reddy. And again, to go to the future, one must look at the past first. And where was the Indian economy before COVID came? And as I said, a lot of it was consumption growth in the last 5 years has been very strong, 7%. But what's less appreciated is that a lot of that consumption was driven not by underlying organic income growth. It was being driven by households running down savings and taking on debt. Now, this is, not abnormal. It's a young economy. People had access to the financial sector. They were consumption smoothing over their lifetime, hopeful about future incomes. The key about future consumption is the perceived permanence of the shock. The more households believe the shock is quasi-permanent and you are more uncertain about your job or your income or your wage, you tend to increase savings. And that's what we're seeing in the household surveys already, that households are telling us going forward, I'll be marking my consumption down, my savings will likely go up. This is different from precautionary saving, which is on account of uncertainty. This saving I'm talking about is the fact that households perceive permanent income has been hit. So don't expect consumption to go back to the same 7-8% growth that we saw pre-pandemic. Yeah. Exports will also be choppy. Think of GDP as being consumption plus exports plus investment plus government spending, right? So don't expect consumption to bounce back sharply. Exports are going to be choppy because the global recovery is going to be incomplete. So if consumption and exports are not giving you much final demand, then it's hard to expect private investment to be booming, because private investment is endogenous to final demand. It needs some driver of demand to invest. And we saw that utilization levels were already below 70% before the pandemic. The reason I'm saying all this is I'm trying to organically build the argument that paradoxically, even in the next couple of years, the government may have to drive growth. Now, what do I mean by that? My own personal preference is a large infrastructure push. Yeah. That we may have to, from the next budget, see a big infrastructure push, the government spending to drive growth. A couple of things on this. One is, why is this so important? Because infrastructure has very high multipliers on the economy. Infrastructure will boost aggregate demand and hopefully crowd in private investment. It's very labor intensive. So it will fill some of the jobs vacuum that the real estate sector has created. And infrastructure also boosts potential growth. So there's a good reason in my mind for the next 2 years for growth to be driven by infrastructure. The $1 million question is, how do you pay for it, given all the fiscal issues we spoke about? And in my mind, kind of the obvious answer here is aggressive asset sales. So ideally, what we want in the next budget is a big infrastructure push financed by a lot of asset sales. There are no shortage of assets to sell in India, infrastructure assets, land assets, public sector enterprises. And given these market valuations, given how equity markets around the world are booming, given the quantum of liquidity, this is a good time to do it. So I would just say that for me, the private sector, it seems, will be recovering slowly around the world, including in India for the reasons I mentioned. So a big infrastructure push, I think, will catalyze activity over the next 4-6 quarters and give time and space for the private sector to heal. That's the reason where, for example, even in the US, despite a huge fiscal stimulus, they're still arguing and debating another fiscal stimulus. Our own House view is if you get a Democratic sweep in the Senate and the presidency in February, you probably get another 1% of GDP or more than that in fiscal stimulus.
Yeah. So, let me come back to the basic point again. I know I'm kind of laboring over this. Say the fiscal support that we talk about, and we I think there has been huge commentary on that, huge debate on that. But, isn't a front loading of fiscal support much more critical in times like this, especially when the duress is felt by the less at the lower income levels, especially with, we have seen how migrants have, the lasting image of this COVID pandemic has been, migrants moving cities, walking, hundreds of kilometers, where, their risk levels are, they really can't take any more risk. Over the last 3 years, as you pointed out, consumption has not been organic, and it has been kind of from household savings and probably increased debt levels. So wouldn't it require of the government to kind of front load the expenditure so that it takes care of at least partially offsets the duress, because individuals can't take the risk or households can't take the risk as much as the sovereign can do? And is this fear of, say, credit rating agencies, is it so, has it really kind of occupied all the mind space?
Yeah.
Is that what you think in the policy circles?
No, let me step back. I think it's a tricky question, and I'll tell you where I come out on this, because of where our starting points are. As I mentioned, with a fiscal deficit of 10% of GDP and debt 72, India doesn't have unlimited fiscal space. Now, a couple of issues that we should clear up, given that this is an explained event. India's fiscal deficit will still increase by about 4.5% to 5% of GDP. So we keep saying there is no fiscal stimulus, but the deficit goes up about 4.5% of GDP. In ordinary times, you would look at that increase and say that's a fairly substantial fiscal injection.
Hang on, Sajjid, just quickly to interrupt, is it also because the GDP is actually shrinking by 10.3%, or in double digits? That's why your deficit looks much larger. But if you look at the absolute amounts?
No, even in absolute amounts, right? So the government's already borrowed 4 lakh crore more in absolute amounts. In dated bonds, there's another 2 lakh crore borrowing of treasury bills. State governments are borrowing more. So this has gone up. The distinction I'm making is different. That even if there's a genuine 4.5% or 5% of GDP in fiscal expansion, in times like this, you have to, and I'm going to avoid too many technicalities, make a distinction between what's driving that deficit expansion. There are 2 sources. One of it is lower tax revenues. And when you've got a contraction of 10% of GDP, given the non-linearity of taxes to GDP, the issue is that the government will probably experience a 3.5% of GDP consolidated, center and states, lower tax revenue than last year. So a lot of that fiscal expansion gets used up by lower tax revenues. Normally that's called an automatic stabilizer, right? And normally automatic stabilizers are fiscal stimulus. But in an environment like this of heightened risk aversion, given the people who will get those tax savings, salaried people, corporations, are very most likely they will save that, not spend it. So the stimulative impact of the automatic stabilizer may actually be very limited, which is why it's important to look at the discretionary component. So if India's deficit expands 4.5% of GDP, our estimate is 3% will be the lower tax revenues, that automatic stabilizers. 1.5% will be more discretionary support. And that's the number that perhaps we will need more of given the evolving economic situation, right? So that's the number to keep in mind, that on average, most emerging markets have about 3% of GDP in discretionary support. India is 1.5%. Now, that's one issue. The second issue to keep in mind is debt. And you brought up ratings agencies. Now, here again, it's important to clear up some misconceptions. Everybody focuses on the level of debt, right? India's debt to GDP will go to 90% in the post-COVID year. Well, guess what? Global debt levels are going to be 100%. The IMF told us yesterday. It's not the level of debt, it's the trajectory thereafter. And that's what rating agencies, in my view, will look at. Is that debt to GDP of 90 going up, or does it stabilize and gradually come down? Now, the most important determinant of that, Vedi, will be growth in the next 5 years. Yeah. If India's growth can go back to 7%, even a large fiscal stimulus this year will mean debt to GDP will stabilize. Yeah. If India's growth, unfortunately, gets stuck at 5%, even a limited fiscal stimulus this year will mean debt to GDP keeps rising. So there are many moving parts here. I think policymakers it's not an easy choice to make. So I'll end by saying this. I think I worry less about the quantity of fiscal support. It's more about do what's necessary. In a crisis year, I think we should provide as much fiscal support as is necessary to ensure that economically viable firms don't go under, that they survive till the post-COVID, that the low-income households get income support. And the thing about precautionary savings is if you promise a timetable of income support to low-income households, then if they've got less uncertainty and there's more certainty about inflows, then they tend to reduce their precautionary savings and spend and backstop the financial sector. It's not an easy choice, but I think these are some of the considerations that policymakers are likely toying with.
Right. Sajjid, in this context, people are talking about, a window of opportunity in the, huge current account surplus that one expects at the end of the year. Can you explain that window of opportunity? Yeah. What does it give and how do you make the most of it?
So there are some folks, market folks who are saying, or ratings agencies who will say, don't have a larger deficit. And what could the different reasons be? Well, debt will go up. We discussed debt. You already have a large deficit, and we spoke about automatic stabilizers versus discretionary. The third reason is how will it be financed? Yeah. And 6 months ago, where we were having this conversation, a lot of the discussion would be that if India has a large fiscal stimulus, the RBI will have to monetize a large amount. And if the RBI does it, what does it do to the reputational risk of the central bank? What will ratings agencies think? Guess what? That has not come to fruition. Between April and September, the extra borrowing by the government this year compared to last year was about 9.5 trillion. Government bonds, state government bonds, treasury bills. The RBI has only had to buy about 1.7 trillion of that. So they haven't had to monetize so much. Why? Because India is running a current account surplus. Now, again, to avoid too many technicalities, what does that mean? An economy's current account surplus is nothing but the savings investment balance. And by running a surplus, what we're saying is the savings investment surplus of the private sector, households and corporations, is higher than the savings investment deficit of the government and the public sector. In other words, India has excess savings at this point in time, right? Because of a current account surplus of about 1.5% of GDP. Now, capital flows have been very strong into India. So the balance of payments surplus is actually 3.5% of GDP. So that's the 3.5% of GDP of excess savings available to the economy. Now, you see that in the banking system where deposit growth is very strong. Banks don't want to take the risk to lend to the real economy. So what are banks doing? They're essentially buying government bonds. So that's how this is working out, that you've got excess savings. The balance of payments surplus is showing up in the 6 trillion of liquidity in the banking system. Banks have this liquidity and they're going to buy government bonds because they don't want to take credit risk to lend to the real economy. So in a way, this is a safety valve for the economy because it means if you have the extra savings, the bad news is it is symptomatic of weak aggregate demand. A current account surplus means aggregate demand is very weak. The good news is it gives you space. If policymakers decide to have more fiscal stimulus this year or early next year, there is space in the economy to absorb that without the RBI having to monetize that deficit and confront difficult trade-offs.
Yeah. So is timing a critical factor in that? Would you kind of use this window of opportunity now rather than later?
Personally, again, my personal view is yes. I think around the world, you need to see two kinds of fiscal responses. In the crisis here, it's about keeping the patient alive. Yeah. It's about making sure aggregate demand is strong enough to keep these small, medium enterprises alive. We've done a very good job on credit.
Yeah.
But remember what credit does. SMEs who get credit, that allows them to pay salaries and other costs, but also increases debt levels. Ultimately, economic viability comes down to revenues. So if the government can boost aggregate demand, which then spills down into small, medium enterprises, their economic viability gets increased. So I would, do what's necessary in the remaining part of this year. Next year, think about infrastructure, but finance that through asset sales.
Yeah. So, but does one thing which several people ask me, and I thought I'll throw it on for you to explain, is this of course we are looking at a contraction of -10+% in the current year. How are markets going up like this? It's 40,000 plus. What explains this rise in markets when even the full year prospects seem to be so dim?
Yeah, for the last few years, I would say starting in 2008, markets are on Mars and the real economy is in Venus. Well, it's a simple phenomenon, which is that global central banks, the G3 central banks, the Fed, the ECB, the Bank of Japan, have thrown the kitchen sink at it. These balance sheets have doubled in some cases. They've gone up by 30, 40% just in the last 6 months. So you've got all this global liquidity sloshing around. And it has to go somewhere. We're not seeing goods price inflation because inflation expectations are so anchored in these developing markets. So we're seeing asset price inflation, right? So, and in fact, central banks will take credit for this to say, normally when you've got such deep contractions, you get stuck in a vicious cycle of financial tightening and weaker growth and a vicious cycle. They've been able to break that link because of this massive quantum of liquidity around the world, which has caused equity markets to go up. It's caused credit spreads to go down. It's caused emerging market assets to rally. So there is a ton of liquidity. But, at some point, these lines cannot diverge forever. All of this market euphoria and buoyancy is expecting growth to recover in the next, few quarters and few years. Yeah. If the real economy continues to struggle around the world, fiscal policy is turned off too quickly in most parts next year, then I'd be surprised if this market euphoria continues.
Yeah. I'll just turn it around for the audience to ask questions. I have a long list of questions for you. May I request Anup Hivase from the Ministry of Finance as a Joint Commissioner to ask his question?
Anup is not here. Can you move to the next one?
Yeah. Sanjay Sethi from Nestor Capital. Sanjay Sethi is here.
Yeah. Mr. Sethi, please unmute yourself.
Sajjid, I had a question of you. Do you see the risk of stagflation in India going forward?
Sajjid, it's a very good question. On paper, we've seen some of that happen in the last 2-3 quarters where growth has contracted sharply, but inflation has picked up. It goes down to what the drivers of inflation are. Recently, I wrote a piece called the RBI's Quadrilemma, which is that the RBI is now in the situation where they have to simultaneously contend with inflation, which has averaged almost 7% through all of 2020, and weak growth, and very strong capital inflows, and an expensive exchange rate. And they've got these multiple objectives. So why is inflation being so sticky? I think there are 2 elements to this. One is the big surprise in the last 3-4 months has been core inflation. Everyone thought that COVID would be disinflationary, as it has in most parts of the world, given how large the demand shock is. But in India's case, core inflation actually went up from below 4% to 5.5%. There were 2 hypotheses for this. My own hypothesis was this was just an adverse supply shock because of the lockdown and the pandemic. And as the economy begins to reopen, the momentum of core inflation would fall. The other worry was, food inflation has been high for the last 8 or 9 months. Is food inflation spilling over into a more generalized inflation? The good news on core is, we got a CPI number 2 days ago, that over the last 3 months, the momentum of core inflation has begun to fall. The annualized momentum was 6% in June. The annualized momentum is 3% in September. So over time, hopefully, as the economy continues to open, we will see core inflation go down. I think the puzzle and the worry is more on the food front, where we've seen, very sticky food inflation for the last 12 months after many years of benign food inflation. And some of this is because of, volatile vegetable prices, but that's continued into October. So October CPI could again be 7%. But again, the hope is that over the next 4-5 months, food inflation will come down because we've had a very strong monsoon. We've had very good sowing. And when that supply hits the market, hopefully this will be disinflationary. That is the base case view that the RBI is also working with. I mean, a lot of the RBI's ability to support the bond market and support growth is predicated on the fact that inflation over the next 6 months comes down from 7% plus towards 4% in the second quarter of next year, both because core inflation keeps falling and food normalizes. Let's hope that that happens, because if food inflation stays sticky and there is any evidence of that spilling over into core, then that will really complicate macroeconomic management further.
May I request Devesh Gupta from KMG Wealth?
Devesh is not there. We'll move to
Okay, we'll move to the next one. Vinayak. Vinayak is also...
Yeah, let me just...
Yeah, Vinayak's there. If you can unmute yourself, Vinayak.
Yeah. Can I ask you?
Sure.
Sir, the question is, what according to you are unconventional methods that the government can take to raise the additional funds to meet additional deficit and for financing fiscal stimulus? Thank you.
Vinayak, thank you. Resource mobilization is going to be absolutely crucial. I think we don't need to get very unconventional. I think, if we were, the government's been bold on many things in the last few months, labor reforms, agricultural reforms, I think privatization and disinvestment needs to be next on the agenda. That there's enough array of assets here that over the next 3 years, if we have a systematic plan, you don't want to rush these off in a fire sale. Have a systematic plan over the next 3 years to sell public sector assets or disinvest in them. You can sell operational infrastructure assets to pension funds around the world and then use those resources to create new infrastructure. I think that's perhaps, in terms of getting you sustained resources, perhaps our best bet over the next 3 years. And remember, one of the concerns is, are we selling our family silver? Well, if we're selling assets that we have on the public sector balance sheet to build high productivity infrastructure, physical infrastructure, health infrastructure, right? That is not selling your family silver. That is an asset swap on the balance sheet where you're selling a low productivity asset that you have to a higher productivity asset for the future that will help potential growth down the line. So for me, I come back to, you can always devise clever methods of getting resources in any 1 year. But given that we're going to have to raise the resource envelope over the next 2 or 3 years, I think, we'll have to bite that bullet at some point in time.
Sajjid, this is exactly where the IMF seems to have a very different view from the government of India. I was just looking at the fine print of the IMF in the World Economic Report. They don't seem to agree with the government of India on their whole privatization target itself. So I think this, when the government of India puts up a budget estimate of proceeds from privatization or disinvestment receipts, it has always fallen short of. And, even this year, we haven't really seen any of the big things which have been in the pipeline for a long time. So does it really give you, and especially when the markets are at the levels that they are today? So what gives you that optimism? Hope.
This was a very turbulent year, and I think given the volatility of markets, this year will be hard to carry out, and especially if you're trying to sell airlines, this is not the year you want to say airlines where airline prospects have been hurt, for example. But I would say even for this year, it wasn't as critical because as we discussed, given the large current account surplus, you could run a larger deficit and still have it financed quite comfortably. This would not be a representative year to judge asset sales. And I would not expect there to be big bang asset sales in a year like this. But I think in the budget from next year is a huge opportunity, because I think this euphoric markets around the world is going to sustain for some period of time. And what gives me hope is two things. One is I think the finance minister has laid out a very clear privatization policy across sectors, where they've said they just want 3 or 4 PSUs per sector. And so there is a willingness here to go down the privatization route. And, I think, India responds best when we have crisis. Privatization and disinvestment was desirable 2-3 years ago. Now I would say it's become absolutely imperative. And it's these two things that give me hope that from the next budget onwards, this could well be a lever that we pull.
Yeah. We have Chandramohan Joshi, who's a professor of economics in a D Society Kirti College.
Yeah.
Mr. Joshi.
Am I audible, sir?
Yeah, sure. Please go ahead.
Yes, good evening.
Okay. Good evening, sir. Sir, I think demonetization and haphazardous implementation of GST had adversely affected our growth rate, particularly when we talk about informal sector. Moreover, this mismanagement of COVID-19 pandemic has derailed our economy further. So in this regard, I have two questions. What is the way forward to generate jobs in the largest labor market of the world? And second is this poor economic performance an act of God?
So let me take the jobs question. And I think it's a good one because, when you do reforms, these aren't in abstract. There has to be a philosophical kind of overview here that drives reforms. And I'm going to say that in a way, with the challenge comes a unique opportunity. And that is you're seeing lots of multinational firms aggressively want to look for second locations in Asia, leaving China. Because the US-China trade war is not going away no matter who wins the election on November 3rd. So there's this China plus one policy we're seeing in the region. So far, Vietnam has benefited a lot. And I think this really is kind of India's moment to capture that opportunity. Why do I say that? Because no country has grown at 7 or 8 or 9% for a decade without strong export growth. So I'm going to continue to bat, and I'll tell you why this is linked to jobs. I'm going to continue to bat for strong export growth. The last time we had 8 or 9% growth between 2002 and 2010, it was because exports were growing at 18% a year for 8 years. So we're going to need strong export growth to drive GDP growth. Now, the connection with jobs is the following, right? That unfortunately, if you look at India's industrial sector, 60% of our firms in manufacturing are firms that hire less than 50 people. 60%, right? So we're littered with very, very small informal firms. One of the reasons India did not benefit much from apparels moving out of China, Bangladesh got it, Sri Lanka got it, Vietnam got it, is our firms in that sector are too small. 92% of India's firms in that sector 10 years ago employed less than 50 people. In China's case, more than 60% of Chinese firms in that sector had more than 200 people. So if you're going to push exports endogenously creates pressure on firm growth. That if you want to compete in the global market, you have to increase in size. And in my view, jobs get created when small firms begin to grow. And we've seen that happen. So if we were to push on exports, my sense is there'll be pressure on firms to grow, and that'll create jobs. And here I would argue that the labor reforms announced in the last few months are important because the fact that those retrenchment levels have gone from 100 to 300 means now firms are incentivized to increase their size. Remember, about 15% of all jobs are, in India's case, formal. 85% are informal. What you want is firms to grow to absorb those informal workers and make them formal. So this is not going to be an easy slog. It's going to be a tough slog. But I'll conclude by saying this. In the very near term, I think we need to do two things. Have a large infrastructure push financed by asset sales, which is labor intensive. But over the next 3 to 5 years, position ourselves to join the Asian supply chain and take advantage of the global export market, which is 18 trillion. That's the market size we should be aspiring for. India's export share is just 1.7%. If we can double our export share from 1.7 to 3.5 or 4, exports will double. And it's that low labor intensive, lower exports, apparel, shoes, that will create jobs and create an incentive for firms to grow and hire more. So I think we need to think of this much more holistically over the next 3 or 5 years.
Yeah, may I request Vinod Sharma?
Yeah.
Yeah, Mr. Sharma, can you just, please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yes.
Actually, I have two questions. One is the government declared many incentives for the big industries and the small scale industries, but there was none for the small shopkeepers, those doing small shops of tea vendors, etc., and any photography shops or any little marriage bell shop. They suffered a lot in the 6 months, and they had to pay rent of their establishments. Government did nothing for them. Is there anything in store for them? And the other question is regarding NPAs that banks are suffering. A lot of NPAs. Uh, Small borrowers, they hypothecate their vehicle or their house which for the loan which they take from banks. And but this is not in case of big industries. Please.
Yeah, no, two good questions, no easy answers. I think when you talk about small shopkeepers, we're just talking about fiscal policy more generally. One of the reasons it's hard to target people in India, because even though there is Jan Dhan accounts, I think that perhaps is the least distortionary way of doing cash transfers. That most people have a bank account, and hopefully, if you get the targeting close to right, at least you can put money in those bank accounts. Otherwise, for example, Europe has done a lot of wage support where it has paid some part of the wage of firms so that people aren't laid off. But the data requirements for that, the ability to target firms in developed markets is, far superior. So I think one of the lessons we've learned in this crisis is from the migrant situation, from the small, medium enterprises, is that we just need more data. We need to get the pipes of delivery cleaned up so that next time something like this happens, that support can be targeted. I think on the NPA issue, this is not going to be easy for any borrower. I think the central bank has done what it could. There was a moratorium. Now there's a one-time restructuring. But I do see that the stress going forward may well be, as you alluded to small, medium enterprises and to retail credit. Remember, the stress in the last cycle was on large corporates. Over the last few years, there's been a lot of credit that's gone to the retail sector. And I think, over the next 6-9 months, we may be revealed that it's retail credit and SMEs that, may well have a large large NPAs. What that means, of course, is that you want to recapitalize public sector banks aggressively and quickly so that, future lending does not get impacted by these NPAs.
Sajjid, just as a follow-on, this during this forbearance has been the word for the banking sector, and I think several measures have been announced by RBI and the government on say relaxation on repayments. The banking sector as it is was reeling under this huge NPA problems, and then on top of it we had also the NBFCs which were facing huge liquidity pressures. As we emerge out of the pandemic, do you see the scenario changing anything or getting worse by the end of 2020-21?
Yeah, no, the financial sector is going to be a key focus area, Vedi, as you suggested. Remember, coming into this, we had a situation where public sector banks had a lot of liquidity, but there was no inclination to lend.
Yeah.
Right? All of the lending was happening by small private banks, private sector banks, and by NBFCs. But those are the very entities whose balance sheets will get questioned. And frankly, given the glut of liquidity in the system right now, the RBI has done very well to ensure there is no financial stability concern. So these entities are able to attract liquidity to manage their asset liability mismatch. But they may not be able to attract liquidity for growth purposes going forward. Right? So my own sense is some of the same issues that were hanging over us before COVID may well have to be resolved post-COVID. Right now, risk aversion in the financial sector is not a problem because the problem is demand. Demand is weak. But when demand picks up, what you don't want is the financial sector to become a constraint in terms of lending. So what do we need to do? Well, I would say, I think the incentive structure for public sector banks needs to change so that they lend more aggressively going forward. I think they'll need to be recapitalized quickly and aggressively. And at some point, any trust deficit that remains with small private banks or with NBFCs will eventually have to be overcome by some kind of AQR. Now, you don't do that in the middle of a crisis, but at some point, you need to do an AQR so that this persistent concern about peripheral NBFCs and private banks who were doing most of the lending disappears. So again, let me summarize by this. Even the central bank's job, I think, in the crisis year versus post-crisis year is going to be different. In the crisis year, it is to ensure financial stability and to ensure that regulatory forbearance causes banks to buy enough government bonds so the borrowing program goes through well. But 1 year from now, we actually want banks to lend. So you want to roll back some of the forbearance on bonds because you don't want government banks to be buying bonds. You want them to lend, and you want to make sure that your resolution mechanisms are very strong and manifold. So there's any restructuring or resolution that can be done very rapidly. So again, these priorities will evolve in the next year or so.
Before I switch over to the next question, Sajjid, one more thing which kind of, always I hear complaints from industry is about the interest rates itself. While one understands that the term premium itself is high, probably many analysts point out that it is at its extreme levels today. The repo rate vis-a-vis the rate at which the government borrows. That, and then the lending rate. Lending rate also, despite the various cuts in policy rates, we haven't really seen a sharp reduction in the lending rates. One is the risk aversion to lend from banks and NBFCs having their own set of problems. The second is the lending rates. So though both the things are at such, are behaving in a manner that, how can anybody expect, say, to borrow from the small guys can never really borrow from the banks, right? Isn't it becoming too difficult in such stressful times also? Unless you have something like that lending facility, which the government of India announced and, where it said guaranteed automatic lending. So unless you do certain things like that, do you see anything happening in that front?
But again, this, I think the RBI has done everything it possibly could. I think we can't blame sticky lending rates on policy rates because think of where the effective overnight rate today is for the banking system. It's 3.30. The repo rate's at 4%, but the actual effective TREPS rate where banks are trading with each other is 3.3%. At a time when inflation is running at 7%, and even 1 year ahead inflation, if it's at 4 or 5%, your effective overnight policy rates minus 200 basis points. So one cannot say that, lending rates are not coming down because policy rates haven't been brought down enough. They have. Again, we cannot blame liquidity. I mean, if banks will not reduce lending rates when liquidity is at 6 trillion, they will never reduce lending rates at all. Exactly. So these used to be the criticisms a year ago. There isn't enough liquidity in the system and policy rates are very sticky. And I think it's clear now that these are not the constraints. The constraint goes back to the plumbing, goes back to the risk aversion that we spoke about in the entire financial system. And for different entities, it's different reasons. I think for public sector banks, that they are risk averse to lend. And I think those incentives have to change for them to lend more aggressively. They should get growth capital, they should get resolution capital, but they have to be incentivized to lend. For the smaller guys who were doing the lending, we need to make sure that they have access to liquidity even for growth, not just for ALM management.
Yeah. Can I request Rishabh Mundada to ask his question? Is Rishabh there? Yeah. Please go ahead, Rishabh.
Yeah. So my question is about the credit growth across various sectors in economy. So what is your take on that, and which all sectors do you think that which might contribute towards the credit growth?
It's a very good question, Rishabh. And I think that's the key issue here, right? That to Vedi's earlier question, credit growth was slowing even coming into COVID, right? And now, if there are heightened credit risk perceptions, banks won't want to lend. So now again, this is chicken and egg. When the economy is slowing, lending standards tend to tighten, and banks don't want to take credit risk, especially when they can buy government bonds. And that's what's happening right now. One of the reasons that the RBI has not had to do more open market operations in the first 6 months is because private sector banks, public sector banks have really loaded up on government bonds because they don't want to take credit risk. Now, going forward, as the economy strengthens, and this is where I think fiscal and monetary have to work together, because if there's more fiscal support, aggregate demand goes up, the viability of firms is perceived to increase, then the banking sector may be more inclined to lend. The larger issue is the following, that before COVID, remember, where was all the credit growth being generated from? It was going to NBFCs, and NBFCs in turn were lending either to households or to small, medium enterprises, or banks were making loans to retail. There wasn't much bank lending happening to large corporates. The worry, if any, is that in the next few quarters, if you're worried about the credit worthiness of retail borrowers, as I mentioned, if 20% of salaried people have lost their job, or you worry about the balance sheets of small, medium enterprises, then even the lending that was happening pre-COVID, will banks want to lend to those sectors? That's an open question. But again, right now, demand's the problem. It's not banks. We can boost aggregate demand, and firm viability increases. Hopefully, banks will be less risk averse.
Yeah. May I ask GS Balaji? Yeah, if you can unmute yourself.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Please go ahead.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Sir, I had posted 2-3 questions, but few of them you have already answered,
Okay.
Mr. Chinoy. So I have a question which is different than what is done. When you say 20% of the salaried class have lost their jobs, are you referring only to the private sector? Because I don't see any government sector person having lost the job. And with no stimulus or no help to the private sector employees who have lost their jobs, there are the rest of the people who have lost salaries also and have got a lot of cut they have taken. So what is the government thinking now when it has given central government employees some kind of a stimulus? Why it is not getting extended to the private sector employees? Thank you.
So, Mr. Baji, I was referring to the CMI data, which talks about this. This is the point that CMI makes, that the total, there has been an improvement in terms of job losses sharply. I think at one point in April, it was 120 million jobs, and now it's come down to 6 million. But the composition of the salary class is what's concerning. I think on the fact that the public sector employees have got that incentive scheme, and I think to utilize that incentive scheme, you have to spend, I think, 3 times. Vedi may know the details better. 3 times as much to utilize that. So the idea is that there'll be some multiplier effect on the economy. This, Mr. Balaji, comes back to the broader question that Vedi and I were discussing, that yes, maybe there is the need for more fiscal support to boost aggregate demand. The question is, where do you direct that? And when do you do it? And there are some constraints of the kind we had discussed earlier.
Sajjid, in that context, may I just push the envelope and ask you, does it make sense to, for the government to intervene with wage subsidies? Because there are some discussions within the government on these lines for those who have lost jobs.
The question again is, how do you target? Which firms do you target? Do we have data for informal firms? It's the same kind of issues we were contemplating when we were looking at the credit guarantee for small, medium enterprises, right? So the credit guarantee was available to SMEs that had already borrowed. What about SMEs that hadn't borrowed? And in a way, wage subsidies are, again, I think the important point about wage subsidies is that they provide certainty of income, and therefore precautionary savings will go down if people have certainty of jobs. But it's a supply side issue. Ultimately, a firm will only hold on to labor if revenues go up and aggregate demand goes up. So I think we need to do what will boost aggregate demand. If small, medium enterprises can see revenues are strong, demand is strong, it will be in their interest to hold on to their workers.
Yeah. So I have an interesting question from Dilip Thosar. Is Mr. Thosar around? because this ties in with what we have been discussing. Yeah, Dilip.
Dilip, please unmute yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Sajjid had recommended that we should increase, the government should spend a lot of money on infrastructure building. With the work from home culture setting in and the logistic industry, kind of totally changing based on that, where should government be spending that money? Because business construction and roads, effectively demand would reduce.
Sorry, is the question where should the infrastructure spend be?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, well, I think India is one of those countries with such a large infrastructure deficit that the question is where shouldn't it be, right? I think, again, this goes back to philosophical orientation. If we're going to position ourselves as joining global value chains, as having exports drive growth, then you want to have infrastructure that is connecting the hinterland to ports. I think all of us will agree health infrastructure will need a big boost going forward. Public health facilities, urban infrastructure needs support. Whether it's highways, whether it's railways, whether it's power, I think there's no shortage of infrastructure here, infrastructure opportunities here. Now, again, it's easier said than done. There are last mile implementation challenges, land acquisitions an issue. You have to find shovel-ready projects. So I'm not arguing that you can build infrastructure in 2 quarters and boost aggregate demand now. I'm just saying that if the private sector is going to take time in the next 12, 18, 24 months to recover, then we should have a large public works program, find shovel-ready projects and execute that. I mean, the other benefit of this is, remember, infrastructure is very labor intensive, right? And what we're seeing is that while some migrant workers have come back from the rural economy, some have not. And the real estate sector used to be a sector which used to absorb a lot of this rural labor that would migrate back to the urban areas. Now, if the real estate sector is going to take time to pick up, one way to attract some of this labor back from rural to urban is to have reasonably large infrastructure projects in the urban areas.
Yeah. May I ask Mudit Jain if he's around?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
So my question for Mr. Chinoy, can you hear me, sir?
Yeah.
So my question for Mr. Chinoy is, which is better to stimulate the economy, consumption or investment? My personal view is consumption, but your take, sir.
Well, the question again is, what is the government's role in this? Because there are many ways that you can do it. And this is a very good question because it's easy to say, spend more money. The question is, how do you have a well-directed fiscal stimulus? And each of the avenues the government goes down will have trade-offs. Let me give you a few examples. The easiest way to do this is to increase NREGA wages, right? And to say, if NREGA wages go up, people will have more incomes and the marginal propensity to consume at the bottom of the pyramid is the highest. But the problem is that at this stage of the cycle, increasing NREGA wages may disincentivize migrant workers who've gone from urban to rural to return back to the urban areas. So in a way, you're distorting the migration choice and you're in that situation. So again, that's one option. When you say boost consumption, I suspect what you're saying is put cash, income support, classical income support. Brazil has done this. Brazil has 8% of GDP in cash transfers. It's gone to the other extreme, right? So put money in the accounts of people and they can spend it. And I think that's a fair suggestion. But then you have to pick your audience and you have to make sure that you provide a timetable of support. Because as I said, if it's a one-off, precautionary savings may be high and you will save that, you may not spend it. If you've got certainty that you're going to get cash transfers for the next 6 months or 9 months, then you may spend it. The third is tax cuts. Tax cuts I would not recommend because the marginal propensity to consume out of tax cuts will be very low. The fourth is public infrastructure. So it's not an easy answer, Mudit. Most countries have chosen some amount of income support, for households and announced some program of that. We don't have unemployment insurance for the urban areas, but we do have automatic stabilizer in the form of NREGA. So maybe some more money for NREGA, some more money for income support, but also I think a big public investment push, because that achieves multiple things at the same time. The multiplier effect of infrastructure is high. It creates jobs, that creates certainty, and people will spend out of that.
May I request Ayan Marwa? Marwa? Hi, Ayan.
Hi,
Yeah.
can you hear me?
Yeah, please.
Sorry. So my question is a little bit different from the theme that we've been going forward with so far. So I wanted to ask, how does the role of foreign investment, especially from China, shift in reality compared to all of the political sort of narratives, given the isolationist atmosphere that exists right now?
That's a very good question. So what you're asking is, is this opportunity for real? I would say yes. We've already seen in the last decade, for example, a lot of that business from China gradually moved to Vietnam, which has become some kind of an electronics hub and has really benefited from that. I think the opportunity is real because most firms now believe that the US-China trade war is not going away in a hurry, that even if there is a Biden presidency and a Democratic Senate, that these frictions will continue, and they're looking for diversification in the region. It's called China plus one. But I want to have some operations in China, but then I want to have one more location as a backup. And if anything, this pandemic has taught up, you want to diversify your risk. So these companies are actively looking, and India has in fact attracted several such companies, particularly in the smartphone arena. Now, tariffs have gone up on smartphones, but 95% of smartphones sold in India are at least assembled in India. Now, the problem with that is that the value add of assembly is quite low. It's between 8 and 12%. But the opportunity does exist. My own view is that if we can create an ecosystem for these firms, see, India has the advantage of having scale and size. So when a firm moves to India, it can simultaneously target the domestic market, but we have to also make it competitive enough for them to export out of India. So we've seen, for example, smartphone exports in India, I think, jumped from something like $200 million 3 years ago to $4 billion. But that's still small. Vietnam's exports are 35 billion. China's at 125 billion. Now, the question is, how do you do it? My own prescription on this is to go back to a model of the past, which is the special economic zone model, the SEZ model. Because if you're looking at global value chains, the SEZ model has been a model that's worked most places around the world. Now, India has occurred a bad name because I think the regulatory framework for special economic zones, needs to be modified, and we need to work on that. But if we can have a SEZ model, I think the Niti Aayog calls it a coastal economic zone, right? People have different names for it. If we have a zone in the country where land acquisition becomes easy, labor laws are flexible, infrastructure is good, port connectivity is strong, and already corporate tax rates for new manufacturing are down to 15%, we may then attract many for firms. And I'll end with this. The demonstration effect here is very important. If, in fact, you get a critical mass of firms setting up in one special economic zone, then the message to the world is very clear that there are these locations in India where firms can produce as competitively as they can in a Vietnam or a Bangladesh or a China. And if one zone works, then you'll get more companies who want to relocate to India. Even domestically, huge demonstration effect. If one state chief minister can get a couple of special economic zones to work and create jobs, attract FDI, then there's a lot of pressure on other chief ministers to follow suit. So I would say it's hard to do factor market reforms, as we're finding out. So instead of trying to reform all factor markets across the country, which is daunting, take a more surgical approach. Let's have one or two SEZs, get it right, use that as a laboratory for experimentation, let firms set up over there. And once we get those right, then we can have a few more across the country.
Yeah. May I request Vidyanand Jha from IIM Calcutta?
Yeah, so very good evening. And I think most of my questions, which I initially had, are answered. But just to take an issue with you, Sajjid, so how do you look at job growth in white collar segment? Say, our graduates who companies like you recruit in next 5 years, because I've understood you said that If companies relocate from China to India, maybe they will take these people. But apart from that, how do you look at this, chances of actually placement in Indian business schools, in next 5 years?
Yeah,
If
no,
it's
it's a
too
good.
specific, you can decide to not answer.
Yeah, I mean, to be very fair, I wouldn't be the best person to answer that. Let me give you a slightly more generic answer, which is that but you asked the defining question of the moment is India is going to have a huge demographic dividend. How do we create the jobs? And I'll tell you why it's such a challenge. Because in the last 4 decades, the labor intensity of manufacturing in India, I know you've asked about services, has actually fallen, right? So in a country which has got high labor endowment, our firms are becoming more and more capital intensive, which is really worrying. Why is that? Because A, the cost of capital has gone down, especially after the global financial crisis, but labor is not seen as an attractive factor of production. And I think that's what we have to change. On the demand side, labor laws have to be liberalized so that firms can deem labor to be more attractive. And on the supply side, we need more education and more skilling. But the larger point is that labor is not seen as attractive as a factor of production in India and even in the world as it should be, given India's huge demographic dividend. And I think that these labor laws that were done need to see is a start in that direction. What do you do on the demand side and the supply side to create to make labor more attractive? And I'll just, with your permission, take another minute. A lot has been said on agricultural marketing reforms, but I think the real challenge for India in the next 10 years is to effect this Lewisian transformation. Agriculture is 14% of GDP, and there are about 40 to 45% of the workforce in agriculture. And in a decade from now, agriculture, given its growth rate of 2 to 3% a year, will be 10% of GDP, and it'll have 40% of the workforce. Even if the entire value add that agriculture creates, there is no middlemen, go to those workers, it's very low per capita income. So the challenge for India is to, on the demand side, create the jobs in manufacturing and services, low-end manufacturing, to effect that transition. So that labor must gradually move out of agriculture towards low-end manufacturing. So your question is well taken on services, but this is a much broader challenge.
May I request Vasu Saxena? Yeah, Vasu.
Yes, since a lot of question seekers were absent, I'll put 3 questions to Sajjid Bhai. I've been listening to him very attentively, and I'm amazed with his depth of knowledge, and therefore I take the liberty of,
Please go ahead.
Connecting all the 3, everything that has already been said, we are leaving it open-ended. So I want to tie up everything in a particular flow and then come to my main forward-looking direction. The first question is, Sajjid Bhai started by saying that we've gone through a $11 trillion economy loss in this 2021 estimate. And for the next 5 years, the loss will never come to the 2019 levels of economy. My question is, how and what modeling tool has been used to estimate 5 years in advance, when 1 month before the COVID also we could not estimate what is going to happen in the next 1 or 2 months? So how can we be so sure of what is going to happen so far in the future when our history has been succumb and quite dependent on external factors not in our control? Having said this, so I'll need a clarification, but let me move on to question number 2.
Can let
Should I answer that?
Yeah. Okay. Sure.
Mr. Saxena, that's a very good question. The forecast I gave you from the IMF, the old joke is that economic forecasts make astrologers look good. And so I plead guilty that there is unprecedented amount of uncertainty about this. But let me clarify what I said while quoting the IMF, just so the facts are clear. What the IMF is telling us is there's a $11 trillion output loss in 2020 and 21 globally compared to what the IMF had projected in December. So in December, the IMF had a certain forecast for the global economy for 2020 and 2021. Now, we're already 9 months into 2020, so we've got a good handle on what this year's growth is going to be. And what the IMF says is, given next year's growth, this is going to be the loss. Just to clarify, number two, it's not that over 5 years, output levels will not go back to 2019. They will go back to 2019 by early 2022. What I meant was over the next 5 years, the IMF estimates that given what it had projected before COVID, compared to what it now projects for the next 5 years, the cumulative output loss over 5 years, which is 11 trillion over 2 years, becomes about 28 trillion. Now, you're absolutely right. We should not take these numbers very precisely because there's so much uncertainty. In a matter of 3 months, the fund has changed its global growth forecast by 80 basis points. There are too many moving variables. When will the pandemic get over? When do we get a vaccine? Will there be more fiscal support? Will there be more monetary support? What is the permanent damage? You're absolutely right. So my intention is not that these numbers matter. It's the quality. It's the qualitative nature of the argument, which is, by all intents and purposes, there will be permanent damage from COVID. We should not come away thinking that 1 year from now, when the vaccine is there, life will go back to normal. Because around the world, small, medium enterprises have closed down and will never come back again. People have lost their jobs and will take time to find new jobs. Labor force participation rates have fallen, and some people may get permanently discouraged. That's the simple point here, because everybody's focusing so much on what is this year's GDP number, next year's GDP number. If you step back and ask yourself, given the quantum of the shock, it's going to have an effect for many years, as was the case in 2008. People don't realize the after effects of 2008, the reverberations lasted well, 3-4 years later. That was my limited point. But please go ahead.
May I request Mr. Saxena to, there are others also who would like to ask. May I just request him?
Yeah. So what do you want me to do? You want me to quickly rush it up to my...
Yeah, if you can just ask one question and leave it at that, we can then accommodate one more person.
It's actually a build-up, so it's actually
so if you can be very brief, yeah?
Yeah, okay. Well, Sajjid has said a lot about the government stimulus and investment into infrastructure based on the public sector asset divestment. So far, in the good times, that could not happen. The government could not get any divestment possible. Now, in the bad times, with everybody very scared of investing and with the Chinese investments kind of blocked, I don't see how this divestment is going to take place. We are only talking. We are only making assumptions. Even the BPCL bid, we have not been able to get one single...
Vasu, I think Sajjid answered this question that,
No. That is what I'm tying up now, no?
Yeah,
so, when this divestment is not going to take place and we are only assuming that everything will work, the entire repair package, the entire economic reversion of back to normal will be based on this divestment is, I think, quite foolhardily. We are just totally
What is the question, Mr. Vasu? Can you please go with the question? You're saying that these questions are, this is not, if you can just ask the question.
Yeah, so there will not be any infrastructure funding possible, number one. Number two, the infrastructure cycle itself is a 20-25 year cycle before any returns from the infrastructure can be gotten. So this model per se that the government is planning is faulty to the core, to the definition. So now my main question comes.
Thank you so much. Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
In the future, I had a list of what are the do's that the government can do to make it rational and more effective. But since you are pressed on other things, we'll talk about it some other time. The main question is the consumption pattern has changed forever. It's like they say, the economy is done so badly only because now man has started buying only what he needs.
Mr. Saxena, you're not coming to the question. May I just request you to be very brief, please?
Yeah, last thing. So in this consumption pattern, only the essentials would get, has a future for growth and for this thing. Many things will die out, like you've already said, Sajjid. Transportation, tourism, etc., will take very, very long. How to modify the investment strategy and the various verticals or the various themes, and how to go about investing in the right themes and the right verticals, so that we can now maximize, bring back the economy to the original and further beyond levels, as well as not keep assuming of what will happen in the past method of trend. Am I clear?
Yeah, so great questions. I'll just respond for 30 seconds. Given the interest of time, Mr. Saxena, we should connect offline. I'll take your details from Vedi. No, I'll just clarify. I'm not for a moment saying that there is a magical solution that this investment will go through seamlessly. We'll get a big infrastructure push and all will be well again. We're just debating where can the growth come from? What are the possible avenues for financing that? There are clearly risks. And what I began by saying is, like the rest of the world, India will also see some permanent damage from this crisis. But let us talk about your good question on consumption offline. And maybe Vedi, if you can connect us offline, that'll be good.
Yeah. May I now request Satvinder Singh?
Yeah.
Hello, good evening, sir.
Yeah, hi, sir.
Hi.
So actually, my question has been answered, but again, I'll ask this question that how banks are going to cope with the rising NPAs due to economic fallout caused by the pandemic, and the measures like GCL and interest subvention schemes really enough to offset the losses caused to the MSMEs?
Yeah. So it's a very good question. The financial sector so far, we've seen lots of liquidity put in. We've seen forbearance. There's been a moratorium. Now we're getting a one-time restructuring. I think it's only over the next 12 to 18 months where we will figure out what the actual damage to financial sector balance sheets are. And there has to be a fine balance here, that on the one hand, you want to keep economically viable firms alive. But in doing that, you don't want the financial sector to take on too much of a hit, because that will make them more risk averse going forward. There is no magic answer here. I will simply say that the must do's will have to be, when it's clear what the hit to the financial sector is. We've seen private sector banks anticipate this and aggressively raise a lot of capital. So presumably, when the cycle turns and when demand picks up, they have not just resolution capital, but they have growth capital. It's the public sector banks that will need to be recapitalized. And I would argue that when they're recapitalized, that should come along with incentives. So they use the capital to actually lend. Here, it was heartening to see the finance minister, I think in the supplementary grants, ask for more recapitalization funds. For me, it again comes down to the sectoral lending. The banks were wary of lending to large corporates. They were lending to SMEs through NBFCs and to the retail sector, to the extent that SMEs and retail will be under some pressure for the foreseeable future. How comfortable will banks be lending to those sectors?
Thank you so much, Sajjid. We have spent almost 90 minutes in this session. I think it's enough. It's time for wrapping it up now. Really thankful that you could make such time for us and all our listeners. Thank you so much.
Vedi, I'm back. Hello?